April 14th, 1943. 200 meters beneath the frigid waters of the North Atlantic, the German submarine U-515 drifted silently through absolute darkness, her hull creaking under the immense pressure of the ocean depths. Inside the cramped control room, Captain Lieutenant Werner Hartmann wiped condensation from the periscope housing and allowed himself a rare smile. They had evaded 3 destroyer passes, and the American convoy above had moved on, its propeller sounds fading into the distance. His crew believed they had found the perfect hiding place in the thermal layers that confused enemy sonar. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What these submariners didn't know was that the Americans had developed a new pattern of depth charge deployment specifically designed for crews who thought they were invisible, and in less than 8 minutes, their world of steel and silence would transform into a nightmare of crushing pressure and rising seawater. Werner Hartmann had been at sea for 63 days. His beard had grown thick and uneven, and the smell of unwashed bodies, diesel fuel, and mildew had become so familiar that he barely noticed it anymore. At 32 years old, he was considered a veteran commander, having survived 11 patrols since 1941. His record showed 4 merchant vessels and 1 escort corvette defeated, earning him the Iron Cross First Class. The control room of U-515 measured barely 4 meters across, packed with valves, gauges, and wheels that controlled the submarine's fate. Chief Engineer Klaus Bergmann stood at the depth gauge, his weathered hands resting on the ballast controls. At 41, Bergmann was the oldest man aboard, a merchant sailor before the conflict who understood machinery the way some men understood music. The hydrophone operator, Oberleutnant Friedrich Meyer, sat hunched over his equipment, one earphone pressed against his head. At 24, Meyer possessed what Hartmann called golden ears, an almost supernatural ability to distinguish between different ship types by their propeller signatures alone. "The American destroyers are moving away, Herr Kaleo," Meyer said, using the abbreviated title of respect for his captain. "Range now 11,000 meters and increasing. Their sonar pings are becoming irregular. I think they've lost us." Hartmann nodded, feeling the tension in his shoulders begin to ease. The convoy they had been stalking consisted of 42 merchant ships carrying supplies from New York to Liverpool. It was protected by 6 escort vessels, 4 destroyers, and 2 corvettes, all equipped with the latest detection equipment. But then everything had gone wrong. A British aircraft had spotted their periscope wake, just as Hartmann was lining up his first target. The alarm had forced an immediate crash dive. For 3 hours, the escort vessels had worked methodically, sweeping back and forth with active sonar, dropping depth charges in patterns designed to force the submarine to move, to make noise, to reveal itself. Hartmann had ordered the submarine to descend to 200 meters, well below the thermocline, a layer of water where temperature differences bent sound waves and created an acoustic shadow. Then he had ordered all non-essential systems shut down. They became ghosts in the deep, barely breathing, hearts beating in slow rhythm. The young torpedoman, Matros Hans Weber, sat at his station with sweat dripping down his face despite the cold. At 19, this was only his second patrol, and the terror of being hunted had stripped away any romantic notions about submarine warfare. "Sir, all systems minimal," Bergmann reported quietly. "Battery power at 62%. We can maintain current depth for another 8 hours if necessary." "It won't be necessary," Hartmann replied, his voice carrying more confidence than he felt. "The Americans lack patience for this kind of work. Another 30 minutes and we'll be alone." 300 meters above, on the bridge of the destroyer USS Bainbridge, Lieutenant Commander Robert Morrison studied the plot table with intense concentration. At 38, Morrison had been hunting submarines since 1942. His ship was a Fletcher-class destroyer, capable of 37 knots at full power, but speed meant nothing in submarine hunting. What mattered was persistence and intelligence. Morrison's executive officer, Lieutenant James Patterson, stood beside him, marking positions on the chart. "The contact went silent here," Patterson said. 200-meter depth, just below the thermal layer. Classic evasion tactic. Morrison nodded. He had read intelligence reports about U-boat commanders who had escaped previous hunts by exploiting thermal layers. But American scientists had been equally busy, developing new weapons specifically designed to counter these evasion techniques. "What's our sonar showing now?" Morrison asked. "Nothing definitive, sir," Patterson replied. "We're getting some strange echoes from the thermal layer, but it could be marine life or water density variations." Morrison walked to the railing and looked out at the grey Atlantic waters. The convoy was now 6 miles ahead. His orders were clear: rejoin the convoy within 2 hours unless definite contact was maintained. But something in his gut told him the submarine was still there. "Hayes, I want to try the new pattern," Morrison said to his weapons officer. "The one from the tactical bulletin." The tactical bulletin Morrison referred to had arrived 3 weeks earlier. It described a new depth charge deployment pattern developed by operational research scientists. Instead of dropping charges randomly, the new pattern created a 3-dimensional grid of explosions designed to cover all possible evasion routes. But there was another element the Germans didn't know about. American scientists had discovered that depth charges set to detonate at 250 meters created a shockwave pattern that could damage submarines even when the explosion occurred 50 meters away. Morrison gave the orders. The Bainbridge would move in a slow, deliberate pattern, dropping charges at precise intervals. 2 other destroyers would coordinate their attacks from different vectors. This would be surgery, precise, calculated, and relentless. Down in U-515, Meyer suddenly stiffened at his hydrophone station. "Propeller sounds returning," he whispered urgently. "Multiple contacts, they're slowing down. Range 6,000 meters. Hartmann felt ice form in his stomach. Destroyers didn't slow down unless they had a reason. "They're coming back for another pass," Bergman observed. "Should we go deeper?" "No," Hartmann decided. "We hold at 200. They're making noise with their propellers, but their sonar can't penetrate the thermal layer effectively. We wait them out." Meyer continued his report, his voice betraying worry. "Sir, there are 3 distinct propeller signatures now, all moving in coordinated patterns. They're positioning themselves in a triangle around our estimated location. On the surface, the 3 American destroyers moved into position with mechanical precision. Morrison had calculated the submarine's most likely position based on its last known course and speed. He couldn't see the submarine, but he could predict where it should be. "All ships in position, Captain," Patterson reported. "Wilkes and Nicholson ready to commence on your command." "Commence attack," Morrison ordered. The first depth charges fell from the stern racks of all 3 destroyers simultaneously. They sank quickly through the green water, arming themselves automatically as they descended. In U-515, Meyer heard them first. "Splashes," he reported, his voice cracking. "Multiple splashes, pattern deployment, distance 400 meters. "Brace for explosions," Hartmann ordered calmly. "Remember, they're far away. The noise will be bad, but we're safe at this depth." The ocean exploded around them. The first charges detonated at 75 meters, creating enormous bubbles of gas. The sound inside the submarine was indescribable, a metallic boom that rattled teeth and shook bones. 5 seconds later, the 150-meter charges detonated, much closer to U-515's depth. The submarine heaved violently to starboard. Light bulbs shattered throughout the boat, plunging entire compartments into darkness. Men who hadn't been holding onto something were thrown against bulkheads. Bergman fought to keep the submarine level as seawater began spraying from a dozen minor leaks. The bowplanes had jammed in the up position. On his gauge panel, warning lights were illuminating. Hydraulic pressure dropping, compressed air leaking, electrical systems shorting out. Then came the deep charges, set to detonate at 250 meters, just below U-515's keel. The explosions were different in character. Less sharp crack, more sustained crushing force. It felt as if a giant hand had grabbed the submarine and was squeezing it. The hull groaned and shrieked, steel plates flexing inward, rivets popping out and ricocheting around the interior. Weber screamed as a rivet shot past his head. The control room filled with a fine mist of oil as hydraulic lines burst. Men slipped on the deck plates as seawater mixed with diesel fuel. "They're not done, sir," Meyer reported with terror in his eyes. "I can hear the propellers repositioning. They're setting up for another run." Hartmann's mind raced through the options. They could try to run, But the motors would make noise. They could surface and surrender, but the standing orders were clear. Submarines did not surrender. Or they could stay where they were and pray the Americans ran out of depth charges before U-515 ran out of structural integrity. All ahead dead slow, Hartmann ordered. Come to bearing 170. We'll try to drift away from their search pattern. Above, Morrison watched the water where the depth charges had detonated. Large patches of oil and air bubbles were rising to the surface, always a good sign. But there was no massive oil slick, no debris field. Any underwater explosions? Morrison asked. Negative, sir, Hayes replied. If we had cracked the pressure hull, we'd have heard secondary explosions. She's hurt but still intact. Prepare second pattern, Morrison ordered. Tighten the spiral. Let's leave them nowhere to hide. The second attack began 12 minutes after the first. This time the destroyers coordinated even more precisely, creating overlapping fields of explosions that covered every possible escape route. The charges fell in groups of 6, detonating in sequence to create a rolling barrage that lasted nearly 3 minutes. Inside U-515, the crew experienced something close to hell. The submarine pitched and rolled like a toy. More equipment failed. The gyro compass spun uselessly. The depth gauge needle bent and stuck, and several sections of the high-pressure air system ruptured completely. The smell of chlorine gas from the damaged batteries grew stronger, forcing men to breathe through rags soaked in oil. One sailor's arm broke with an audible snap as he was thrown against a valve wheel. He bit down on his screams while the medic tried to splint the injury. Bergman was fighting a losing battle with the ballast controls. The submarine had taken on at least 3 tons of water. To compensate, he was blowing ballast with the remaining compressed air, but the reserves were dropping fast. Hartmann knew they had reached the critical moment. His boat was dying by degrees, and the Americans weren't stopping. The old assumptions about depth charge attacks, that they were random, that thermal layers provided protection, were being systematically dismantled. Surface the boat, Hartmann said quietly. The control room fell silent except for the groaning of tortured metal. Every man understood what the order meant. Surfacing meant exposure, meant becoming a target, meant probable capture. But it also meant breathing fresh air and having a chance, however slim, that the American commander might take prisoners. Bergman opened the ballast valves fully, blowing every remaining pound of compressed air into the tanks. U-515 began to rise, slowly at first, then faster, as buoyancy overcame weight. She's surfacing, the sonar operator on the Bainbridge announced. Definite upward movement. Morrison grabbed his binoculars. A moment later, a dark shape broke through the surface, water cascading off its conning tower. The submarine sat low in the water, obviously damaged, oil spreading around its hull. Cease depth charge attacks, Morrison ordered. All ships prepare to engage surface target, but hold fire until I give the command. Morrison was giving the Germans a chance to surrender rather than forcing a surface action. It was calculated mercy, but also practical. Submarine crews possessed valuable intelligence. On U-515's conning tower, Hartmann emerged into brilliant sunshine. The 3 destroyers were arranged around his submarine in a perfect triangle, main guns trained on his position. They're ordering us to abandon ship, sir, Meyer reported. They want all crew on deck with hands visible. Hartmann nodded slowly. He took one last look at his submarine, at the boat that had been home for 63 days. Pass the word, Hartmann said. All hands abandon ship. Orderly evacuation. Officers last. Over the next 20 minutes, 46 men emerged from U-515 and climbed into life rafts the Americans had launched. They watched from the water as demolition charges detonated deep inside their submarine. The boat settled lower, water pouring through the conning tower hatch. Then, with a final shudder, U-515 slipped beneath the surface and began her last dive. The American destroyers recovered the German submariners with professional efficiency. Morrison watched as the bedraggled men were brought aboard, wrapped in blankets, given hot coffee and medical attention. Later that afternoon, Morrison sat down with Hartmann in the destroyer's wardroom. "You kept coming back," Hartmann said. "In every previous attack, the escorts would drop charges for 30 minutes, maybe an hour, then return to their convoy. You stayed for nearly 3 hours. And your pattern, it was different." more scientific. "We've learned a lot in 3 years of conflict," Morrison explained. "Our scientists study acoustics, pressure waves, submarine behavior patterns. We share information, develop new tactics." Hartman looked down at his coffee cup. "We were trained to use the thermal layer to go deep and stay silent. It always worked before." "New fuses," Morrison explained, "set to detonate at specific depths. And we've learned to predict where submarines will hide based on water temperature, time of day, distance from last contact. You were following your training perfectly, which meant you were predictable." The words hit Hartman hard. His entire tactical approach had been based on patterns that the Americans had studied and countered. "How many submarines have you captured or sunk this way?" Hartman asked. "This is our 6th successful hunt using the new pattern," Morrison replied. 3 submarines captured, 3 confirmed destructions. The tactical bulletin went out to the entire Atlantic fleet 3 weeks ago. 6, Hartman repeated softly, "in 3 weeks. For every submarine like his that had encountered the new tactics, there were dozens more still operating under the assumption that the old methods worked." Over the following days, as the Bainbridge made its way back to port, Hartman had time to reflect. His crew was alive, which was more than could be said for thousands of other submariners. But the psychological impact ran deeper than mere survival. He had been supremely confident in the thermal layer's protection. His final thought before the first depth charges fell had been, "They'll never find us here." But they had found him with a precision that suggested his position had never really been in doubt. The Americans hadn't been searching blindly. They had been executing a plan. When the Bainbridge reached port in Norfolk, Virginia, the German submariners got their first look at American industrial capacity. The harbor was filled with ships, destroyers, cruisers, escort carriers, all moving with purposeful efficiency. Cranes unloaded cargo at a pace Hartman found difficult to comprehend. One American guard noticed Hartman staring at the harbor activity. "This is just one port, friend," he said through a translator. "We got yards like this all up and down the coast, ships coming off the ways every week." The statement wasn't boastful, it was factual. Hartman did the mathematics in his head. If America was producing ships at this rate, and if submarine tactics had been compromised by new detection methods, then the entire strategic basis of the submarine campaign was collapsing. Intelligence officers eventually questioned the U-515 crew. The Americans already knew the submarine's maximum depth, its fuel capacity, its standard patrol areas. They asked specific questions that revealed they had sources of information beyond what captured crews could provide. The interrogation officer was candid with Hartman. "We respect your courage," he said. "Submarine service takes special bravery, but courage doesn't change the outcome when the mathematics are against you. Your boats are effective weapons, but we have more resources, more technology, and more production capacity than you can overcome." Hartman wanted to argue, to insist that German submarine commanders would adapt, but he had seen the harbor, had experienced the new depth charge patterns, had felt his sophisticated submarine reduced to a leaking wreck in 3 hours. The will to fight remained, but the belief in victory had been shattered as thoroughly as U-515's pressure hull. The crew spent the remainder of the conflict in a prisoner camp in Arkansas. They followed news through censored newspapers. Each month brought reports of more submarines lost, more convoys arriving safely, more Allied ships launched. Young Weber worked in the camp's farm detail, growing vegetables under hot sun. He made friends with guards, learned basic English, and began to think about a future that didn't involve warfare. The trauma of that final patrol stayed with him, the sounds of the hull creaking, the smell of chlorine gas, but it faded gradually into memory. Meyer suffered hearing damage from the depth charge concussions. In the camp, he worked in the library, organizing books in silence. No longer able to hear the subtle sounds that had made him valuable, he didn't mind the quiet. After years of listening for propellers and torpedoes and possible ending, silence felt like peace. Bergman became the camp's unofficial engineer, fixing broken farm equipment, rigging improvised systems. The American camp commander, recognizing his skills, gave him increasing freedom and responsibility. Hartman struggled more than most. As commander, he felt responsible for the loss of his boat, even though any objective analysis would conclude he had made the right decisions. He spent long hours writing detailed accounts of U-515's final patrol, trying to understand the new reality that had destroyed his previous certainty. In late April of 1945, news reached the camp that the conflict in Europe had ended. Hartmann and his crew heard the announcement with complex emotions: relief that the dying was over, grief for homeland, uncertainty about what came next. When Hartmann finally returned to Germany in 1946, he found a country transformed. The submarine pens had been demolished. Most of his fellow commanders were gone, their boats resting on the Atlantic floor. He visited the families of his crew members, bringing word that their sons and husbands and brothers were alive and coming home. In these conversations, he often found himself telling the story of U-515's final hours. The families wanted to hear about heroism, but Hartmann told them something different: a story about industrial capacity, scientific innovation, and the reality that conflicts are won not by individual bravery, but by nations' ability to mobilize resources and intelligence. In the post-conflict years, as historians began analyzing the Atlantic campaign, U-515's capture became a case study in the evolution of anti-submarine operations. The interrogation reports and Hartmann's own detailed accounts provided a comprehensive picture of how tactics had changed. The creeping barrage pattern that Morrison had employed became standard doctrine, taught at naval academies. The idea of using scientific analysis to predict submarine behavior revolutionized maritime operations. Morrison retired from the Navy in 1956 as a Rear Admiral. He occasionally gave lectures at the Naval War College. In one talk, a student asked if he had felt satisfaction in forcing the submarine to surface. "The satisfaction wasn't in defeating one submarine," Morrison replied. "It was in proving that systematic approaches work better than heroic individualism." Captain Hartmann was skilled and brave, but he was following patterns we had learned to predict. The real victory was the hundreds of merchant ships that reached port safely because we had figured out how to counter submarine tactics effectively. Hartmann's post-conflict life took an unexpected turn. He became a technical consultant for the emerging German Navy, helping train new submarine officers with full knowledge of modern detection methods. His lectures emphasized the importance of understanding enemy capabilities and never assuming that depth and silence guaranteed survival. When young officers would ask about his most memorable patrol, he would tell the story of April 14th, 1943. The day he sat at 200 meters, supremely confident in his invisibility, while American destroyers prepared a bombardment pattern that would force him to surface within 3 hours. The day his certainty about submarine operations had been systematically dismantled by better tactics and better intelligence. He would end the story with a simple lesson: never assume your advantages are permanent. Whatever techniques work today, your enemy is studying them, developing counters, preparing surprises. The thermal layer that saved submarines in 1941 was being exploited by sonar operators in 1943. The depth that seemed safe became a trap when new fuses allowed charges to detonate precisely at that depth. Weber lived into his 80s. In his later years, he sometimes spoke with school groups about his experiences. Students would ask if he had been afraid, if he had thought he would perish, if he hated the Americans who had hunted his submarine. Yes, he had been terrified. Yes, he had thought his end was imminent. But no, he didn't hate the Americans. They were doing their job, protecting their ships. The real challenge hadn't been individual sailors on destroyers. It had been the circumstances that had led to conflict in the first place. The students would ask what lesson he had taken from his submarine experience. "Don't be so certain of anything that you stop thinking critically about it," Weber would reply. "We were certain the thermal layer would protect us, certain our tactics were superior, certain we understood how submarine operations worked. And we were wrong about all of it. The Americans had done their homework, developed better methods, and we paid the price for our assumptions." As the decades passed, U-515 became a footnote in the larger history of the Atlantic campaign. But for those who studied the evolution of anti-submarine tactics, her final patrol remained significant, a perfect example of how scientific thinking and systematic approaches could overcome traditional military advantages. The lessons learned from that April day in 1943 extended far beyond submarine operations. Military organizations worldwide adopted the principle of using operational research and systematic data collection to improve tactics. The idea that you could study enemy patterns, develop countermeasures, and deploy them systematically became fundamental to modern military thinking. In 2007, a maritime archaeology team using advanced sonar located the wreck of U-515, lying in approximately 3,000 meters of water. The submarine was remarkably intact, having imploded during her final descent, but maintaining her overall structure. No attempt was made to recover anything from the wreck. She remains on the ocean floor, a memorial to the 46 men who survived her loss and the thousands of other submariners who didn't survive theirs. Divers who have seen the video footage describe it as haunting, a weapon that had once seemed so formidable, now just a dark shape in darker water, overcome not by heroic combat, but by better science, better tactics, and better preparation. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.